Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about workers' compensation premium negotiating ideas. And the next concept we're going to talk about has to do with high experience modifications and how clients can negotiate lower pricing today despite a higher experience modification. There are several things that a client can, along with their broker, can do. First thing we'll talk about are what are called experience modification audits. It's estimated that as many as 30% of all companies in California have an experience modification that is incorrectly calculated. Technically, the only reason you can fight an experience modification calculation is based on clerical error, but there are many clerical errors in these experience modification calculations. So how do you fight the experience modification? First, the hardest part is you're going to have to gather a lot of information. The modification is calculated based on historical payroll and historical losses going back 4 years, not including the most current year. So the client's going to have to gather that information at the time that the experience modification was calculated. That can be challenging, but it's not impossible. Once the client gathers this information, it's really easy for a good broker to actually do the calculation and see if in fact the calculation was done properly. As a side note, there are a lot of firms that try to come in and perform these audits for clients, but they charge as much as 45% of the savings, which we think is typically outrageous for any sizable client. Because the amount of work on the part of the brokerage firm, a good broker could probably do this work in about 30 minutes if they have all of the information. The burden's really on the client to gather all of the information. But once that information is gathered, it's fairly easy for a broker to do the calculation. So challenge your audit. See if it's possible to drive the experience modification down right now based on a clerical error. Next, we're going to talk about alternatives to guaranteed cost programs which don't require that you use the experience modification or that allow you to mitigate the impact of a high experience modification. We're going to come back to staffing firms, but let's talk first about captive insurance companies. There are a lot of captive insurance options out there in the marketplace today, and for smaller clients, group captives are becoming very common. So a captive can price whatever it wants. It has a big enough premium base that it basically charges whatever the actuaries for that captive decide to charge. And it's a way that you can circumvent the impact of an experience modification. Many group captive insurance companies are really just like buying insurance. You can go into the captive this year and you can come out next year, and it's really quite simple. There are more complicated captive alternatives out there where it's more of a long-term commitment because of the capital required when you go into the captive. But a lot of group captives are really quite simple to go in and out of, and there are a lot of those options out there. For larger clients, a large deductible option is a good way to circumvent the impact of the experience modification, but you have to have premium probably in excess of about $500,000 for it to start to make sense. $400,000 to $500,000 is probably a minimum threshold, but once you get to that point, because the client assumes a significant portion of the risk in the terms of the deductibles will range $250,000 and up, the premium goes way down. So while the experience modification still has to be used, in terms of the calculation, the premium is so much smaller that the impact of the experience modification is much less. Next, PEOs, or professional employer organizations. This is a complicated subject. There are a lot of ramifications, good and bad, in terms of joining PEOs. But we've had some clients work with PEOs for several years, and it is a really good way, depending on the PEO, to circumvent a high experience modification and circumvent the impact of a high experience modification. Again, very complicated area. We have another section on PEOs if your broker or you are considering this alternative, so you can look at all of the ramifications. We also have some good checklists because we've worked with many PEOs. We have some good checklists to go through if you're looking at a PEO option to make sure you're considering all the alternatives. But PEOs, especially the larger PEOs, can ignore your experience modification because they can charge pretty much whatever they want for your workers' compensation portion of the PEO charges. Group self-insurance, this is another area where technically they have to use your experience modification, but there's great flexibility in the pricing for group self-insurance, and so you can end up offsetting or mitigating the impact of a high experience modification if you go into a group self-insurance program. Some qualifications here. Group self-insurance is complicated. There are some financial requirements of those people who participate, which you have to go over carefully with your insurance professional. Joint and several liability, I'll just throw that phrase out there for you to discuss with your insurance professional. That's probably the most significant one. We tend to believe you need to have a very large group self-insurance program and have very good experience for us to recommend to clients to go into one. But it is another alternative if you have a high experience modification to circumvent the impact of your experience modification. Lastly, we'll talk about staffing firms as distinct from professional employer organizations or PEOs. We've had some clients that have decided to use staffing firms to either hire employees or move a division or move higher cost from a workers' compensation standpoint, move higher cost employees into the staffing firm for a time and to use the staffing firm's lower workers' compensation rates for a time. So that is a tactic where you can keep the bulk of your employees under your employment, and you can use a staffing firm to drive a lower rate for a portion of your employees that have a very high experience modification driven net rate on their workers' compensation.